My name is Sarah Williams. I'm 52 years old, and for 28 years I wore the uniform of the United States Army. I commanded supply convoys through hostile territory, managed emergency evacuations under fire, and earned the respect of soldiers who trusted me with their lives. My service record was spotless, until one decision in Afghanistan changed everything. That decision cost me my rank, my reputation, and eventually, my family. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. Last Tuesday, I sat in the back row of Riverside County Courthouse, dressed in a simple black suit I'd bought at a thrift store 3 towns over. I wasn't there by choice. A subpoena had dragged me into a custody hearing where my own family was fighting over who would raise my 10-year-old nephew Tommy after my sister Jennifer's car accident left her in a coma. My father, Robert Williams, sat in the front row wearing his best Sunday jacket, the same one he'd worn to every important family event since retiring as Millfield's police chief. My brother Michael, sharp in his expensive attorney suit, shuffled through legal documents like he was preparing for the biggest case of his career. None of them had spoken to me in over 8 years, not since the day they decided I was no longer worthy of the Williams name, not since the headlines branded me a coward, not since they chose to believe a lie rather than hear the truth I wasn't allowed to tell. The hearing was supposed to be routine. Michael would present his case for custody, supported by character witnesses and financial statements. My father would testify about family stability and traditional values. I was only there because Tommy had specifically requested that Aunt Sarah be present, though I wasn't allowed to speak on his behalf. The judge had made it clear that my military discharge under controversial circumstances made me an unsuitable guardian candidate. I expected to sit silently, watch my family divide up the pieces of a life I was no longer part of, and leave the same way I came. Invisible. Forgotten. Dismissed. But 20 minutes into the proceedings, something extraordinary happened. The heavy oak doors at the back of the courtroom opened with a soft creak, and Bailiff Marcus Johnson, a man I'd never met before that day, turned from his position near the judge's bench and looked directly at me. His eyes widened with recognition I couldn't understand. Then, in front of a packed courtroom, in front of my father, who had once told me never to wear a uniform in his presence again, in front of my brother, who had publicly disowned me, Marcus Johnson came to attention and rendered a sharp, military salute. "Colonel Williams, ma'am," he said, his voice carrying across the stunned silence of the courtroom, like a bell announcing something sacred. The entire room froze. Papers stopped rustling. Conversations died mid-sentence. Judge Patricia Martinez looked up from her notes with surprise. My father's face went pale, his knuckles white against the wooden bench. Michael's pen clattered to the floor. And for the first time in nearly a decade, every person in that courtroom was looking at me not with pity or disdain, but with confusion that would soon transform into something else entirely. You see, what happened next would force my family to confront a truth they'd spent 8 years running from. A truth about what really happened in Kandahar province in 2012. A truth about why I lost my rank, why I never defended myself, and why I'd carried their shame in silence, while the real story remained buried in classified files and sealed testimonies. If you think you know what courage looks like, if you think you understand the price of doing what's right, when the whole world tells you you're wrong, then stay with me. Because this story isn't about redemption or forgiveness. It's about the moment when silence finally breaks, and the people who wrote you off realize they never knew you at all. The first time I realized my family saw me as broken goods was at Tommy's 5th birthday party. It was 2018, 6 years after my discharge, and I'd driven 3 hours from my tiny apartment in Columbus to Millfield for what I thought would be a normal family gathering. I brought Tommy a remote-controlled helicopter, military-grade but sized for a child, thinking he'd love the precision engineering and the way it could navigate tight spaces. When I walked into my childhood home on Maple Street, the conversation in the living room stopped, like someone had hit a pause button. My sister Jennifer was hanging streamers in the corner, her movements suddenly stiff and deliberate. My brother Michael looked up from his phone with the expression of someone who'd just stepped in something unpleasant. My father emerged from the kitchen carrying a tray of hamburger patties, took one look at me, and muttered something under his breath that sounded like, "Here we go again." But it was Tommy's reaction that cut deepest. This little boy I'd held as a baby, who used to run to me with outstretched arms whenever I came home on leave, took one look at me and actually stepped backward. He didn't hide behind his mother's legs or cry. He just moved away, like I was a stranger who'd wandered into his party uninvited. "Sarah," Jennifer said, her voice carefully neutral, "we weren't sure you were coming." I held up the wrapped present. "Tommy asked me to bring him something that flies." "Did he?" Michael's tone carried an edge I'd never heard before. "When exactly did you talk to Tommy?" The question felt like an accusation. I realized then that my family had been monitoring my contact with my nephew, filtering my calls, screening my attempts to stay connected. I was being treated like a threat to my own blood. "Last month," I said quietly, "when I called to wish Jennifer happy birthday." "Right," Michael said, not looking up from his phone. "That call." The party continued around me like I was furniture. Children ran through the house playing games. Adults clustered in comfortable groups sharing stories and laughter. But I found myself standing alone by the window, watching the neighbor's dog dig holes in the backyard. When it came time to open presents, Tommy worked through the pile with the methodical enthusiasm only 5-year-olds possess. He got books and clothes and toys that beeped and flashed. When he reached my helicopter, he tore away the paper with genuine excitement. "Wow," he said, holding the sleek machine up to the light. "It looks real." "It's based on a real reconnaissance helicopter," I told him, kneeling down to his level. "See these tiny cameras? They actually work. And if you learn to fly it properly, you can navigate it through any room in the house without crashing." Tommy's eyes lit up with the kind of wonder that makes birthdays magic. He turned to his mother. "Mom, can Aunt Sarah show me how to fly it?" The room went quiet again. Jennifer glanced nervously at Michael, who was now watching our interaction with the intensity of a prosecutor studying evidence. My father had stopped mid-conversation with Uncle Pete and was staring at us with something that looked like concern. "Maybe later, honey," Jennifer said. "After lunch." But later never came. As the afternoon wore on, I noticed that whenever I tried to engage with Tommy, an adult would suddenly appear with a distraction. Michael needed him to help carry plates to the kitchen. Jennifer remembered a game she wanted to show him in the basement. My father discovered an urgent need for Tommy's assistance in the garage. I was being systematically separated from my nephew like I was some kind of security risk. The final blow came when I overheard Michael talking to his wife Lisa in the hallway. They thought I was outside, but I'd only stepped onto the back porch for air. "I don't like how excited he gets around her," Michael was saying. "It's not healthy." "She's his aunt," Lisa replied, though her voice carried uncertainty. "She's unstable, Lisa. You've seen the articles. You know what happened overseas. The army doesn't just discharge people like that for no reason." "But she seems what, normal?" "So did Ted Bundy." "Look, I'm not saying she's dangerous, but she makes poor decisions under pressure. The whole family suffered because of her choices. I won't let Tommy get attached to someone who's going to disappoint him." I stood on that porch feeling like I'd been struck by lightning. Not because Michael's words were cruel, though they were, but because I realized he genuinely believed them. In his mind, I wasn't his sister who'd served her country and made a difficult choice under impossible circumstances. I was a cautionary tale, a family embarrassment, someone whose judgment couldn't be trusted around children. When I came back inside, the party was winding down. Parents were collecting their kids, thanking Jennifer for a lovely afternoon, promising playdates and future get-togethers. I found Tommy in the living room, carefully placing his new helicopter back in its box. "Are you going to practice flying it?" I asked. He looked up at me with those serious brown eyes that reminded me so much of Jennifer when we were kids. "Mom says maybe when I'm older." "Older?" "She says it's too advanced for me right now. Maybe when I'm 7. I felt something inside me break a little. Not because of the helicopter, but because I realized my gift had become another way for my family to keep distance between Tommy and me. They'd take the present but remove my connection to it. Let him enjoy the toy but forget who taught him what it represented. "Tommy," I said, sitting down on the floor beside him, "do you know what your Aunt Sarah used to do in the army?" He shook his head. "I helped people who were in trouble. Sometimes that meant flying helicopters like this one to places where people needed help. And sometimes it meant making really hard choices about what was right and what was wrong. "Were you a hero?" he asked with the directness only children possess. Before I could answer, Jennifer appeared in the doorway. "Tommy, sweetie, Aunt Sarah needs to get going. It's a long drive back to Columbus." I hadn't said anything about leaving, but I understood the message. The party was over for me, even if it continued for everyone else. I hugged Tommy goodbye, feeling his small arms squeeze around my neck with an affection that made me wonder what stories he'd been told about why Aunt Sarah lived so far away and visited so rarely. As I walked toward my car, Michael followed me onto the front porch. For a moment, I thought he might apologize for what I'd overheard, or at least acknowledge that his words had been harsh. Instead, he crossed his arms and looked at me, with the expression of someone delivering bad news. "Sarah, I think it would be better if you didn't come to family events for a while." "A while?" "Tommy's at an impressionable age. He doesn't understand why you're not in the Army anymore, and it's confusing for him when you show up and then disappear for months at a time."
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story.
"I disappear because I'm not invited. You're not invited because your presence makes everyone uncomfortable. Dad's blood pressure spikes every time your name comes up. Jennifer has to explain to her friends why her sister was discharged under controversial circumstances. And I have to deal with partners at my law firm who've seen the news articles and wonder if the Williams family can be trusted with sensitive cases." I stared at my brother, this man who used to build blanket forts with me and Jennifer in the basement, who used to beg me to tell him stories about Army training when I came home on leave. "So that's it? I'm officially uninvited from my own family?" "You uninvited yourself when you made the choices you made in Afghanistan." "You don't know what choices I made in Afghanistan. I know what the newspapers said. I know what the military tribunal concluded. I know that good soldiers don't get discharged for following orders." He turned to go back inside, then paused. "Sarah, I'm not trying to be cruel. I'm trying to protect what's left of our family's reputation. Dad worked 30 years to build respect in this community. Jennifer's kids go to school here. My law practice depends on people trusting the Williams name. We can't keep defending decisions you made that we don't understand and can't explain." That night, I drove the 3 hours back to Columbus in complete silence. No radio, no podcasts, just the sound of highway asphalt under my tires, and the weight of realizing I'd become a stranger to the people who were supposed to love me unconditionally. I'd lost more than my rank and my career in Afghanistan. I'd lost my place at the table where I'd learned what family meant. But what my family didn't understand, what they'd never bothered to ask about, was that the choice I'd made in Kandahar wasn't about following or disobeying orders. It was about choosing between the letter of military law and the spirit of human decency. It was about deciding, in a split second under enemy fire, whether to save lives or save face. And it was about accepting that sometimes doing the right thing means everyone else gets to think you did the wrong thing. For 8 years, I'd carried their disappointment like a stone in my chest. I'd accepted their judgment, absorbed their shame, and built a quiet life far enough away that my presence wouldn't complicate their carefully maintained reputations. I'd become the Williams family secret, the cautionary chapter they'd prefer to skip when telling their story. But secrets have a way of surfacing when you least expect them. And sometimes the people who think they know your story discover they've only been reading the footnotes. The Williams family had rules. Unspoken but absolute, passed down through generations like heirloom china, that nobody dared to break. We were raised to believe that honor wasn't something you earned, it was something you inherited, polished weekly and displayed with quiet pride. Service wasn't a choice in our household, it was an expectation woven into the fabric of who we were supposed to become. My grandfather, Thomas Williams, had served in Korea and came home with medals he kept in a wooden box on his dresser. He never talked about the war, but every Sunday after church he'd take that box down and clean each medal with a soft cloth, his fingers moving over the bronze and silver like he was reading Braille. My father watched those rituals as a boy and decided that protecting people was the highest calling a Williams could answer. He became a police officer at 22 and spent the next 3 decades building a reputation as someone who could be trusted with the town's darkest secrets and heaviest burdens. When Michael was born, Dad started a savings account for his police academy tuition before my brother could walk. When Jennifer came along, he bought her books about forensic science and criminal justice, convinced she'd follow the family tradition of public service. But when I arrived, the youngest and most stubborn of the Williams children, Dad saw something different. Maybe it was the way I took apart every toy to understand how it worked, or how I organized my bedroom like a military barracks by age 7. But he recognized that my version of service would take me farther from home than Millfield could contain. "That girl's got the heart of a soldier," he used to tell people, and in our family, there was no higher compliment. I enlisted the day after my 18th birthday, despite having scholarship offers from 3 universities. My parents drove me to the recruiting station in Dad's old Ford pickup, the same truck he'd used to teach all 3 of us how to drive. Mom packed sandwiches for the road like we were going on a picnic, instead of beginning my transformation from small-town girl to United States soldier. Dad shook the recruiter's hand and told him, "You're getting one of the good ones. Take care of her, and she'll take care of everyone else." For the first 10 years of my military career, those words proved prophetic. I excelled in basic training, earned commendations in advanced leadership school, and found myself drawn to the complex logistics of moving people and supplies through dangerous territory. I wasn't the soldier who kicked down doors or engaged in direct combat. I was the one who made sure the door kickers had food, ammunition, and a clear path home when their mission was complete. My family celebrated every promotion like it was a national holiday. When I made sergeant, Dad organized a barbecue in the backyard and invited half the neighborhood. When I earned my commission as a second lieutenant, Mom framed my photo and hung it in the hallway between Michael's law school graduation picture and Jennifer's teaching certificate. We were the Williams success story, proof that hard work and strong values could launch small-town kids into lives of meaning and impact. But success in the military isn't just about individual achievement. It's about understanding that every decision you make ripples outward, affecting not just your unit or your mission, but the families back home, who trust you to represent their values on foreign soil. For years, I carried that responsibility with pride, knowing that somewhere in Millfield, my father was telling people at Tony's Diner about his daughter, the Army officer, and my mother was saving newspaper clippings about military operations, hoping to catch a glimpse of my work in the articles about distant conflicts. The first crack in our family's perfect narrative appeared in 2011, during my second deployment to Afghanistan. I'd been promoted to captain and was commanding a supply convoy unit responsible for moving equipment and personnel between forward operating bases in Kandahar province. It was dangerous work that required split-second decision-making and the ability to adapt when carefully laid plans encountered the chaos of war. 3 months into that deployment, I received a letter from home that changed everything. Not because of what it said, but because of what it revealed about how my family was beginning to see my service differently. Michael had been elected to the Millfield City Council, a stepping stone toward the bigger political aspirations Dad had always encouraged. But during his campaign, questions had arisen about whether having a sister in active combat might affect his judgment on local defense contracts and veterans issues. "I'm proud of what you're doing over there," Michael wrote, "but I need you to understand that people are watching our family differently now. Your service reflects on all of us, and I can't afford to have that reflection be anything less than heroic." The word heroic stuck with me for weeks, not because I disagreed with wanting to serve honorably, but because it suggested that my value to my family was now measured by how well my choices enhanced their public image. I wasn't just Captain Sarah Williams anymore. I was the Williams family's representative in uniform, and any misstep I made would tarnish their carefully cultivated reputation. That pressure intensified when I was selected for a special assignment working with refugee evacuation protocols in contested areas. The work was classified, which meant I couldn't share details with my family, but it involved coordinating with civilian aid organizations to move non-combatants out of areas where fighting was expected to intensify. It was exactly the kind of mission that aligned with everything the Williams family claimed to believe about protecting the innocent and serving something greater than ourselves. But classified work creates distance. When I called home, I had to deflect questions about what I was doing, where I was going, and why certain missions couldn't be discussed. My family, accustomed to celebrating my achievements publicly, found themselves unable to brag about work they couldn't understand or explain. Dad stopped mentioning my service to his coffee shop companions. Mom quit saving newspaper clippings because she couldn't identify which operations involved her daughter. Michael began introducing me to his political contacts as my sister who's deployed somewhere overseas, instead of Captain Williams, who's doing important work in Afghanistan. The silence became a wedge. Not malicious, but real. Phone calls grew shorter and less frequent. Care packages from home contained generic items, instead of the personalized touches that had once reminded me of family inside jokes and shared memories. When other soldiers received letters full of hometown news and family updates, my mail carried polite inquiries about my health and weather reports from Ohio. I tried to bridge that growing distance by focusing on the aspects of my work I could discuss. I told them about the Afghan interpreters I was training, the supply chains we were improving, and the small victories that made dangerous missions worthwhile. But without context, these stories sounded hollow, like someone describing a movie they'd seen rather than experiences that were shaping who they were becoming. The final letter I received from home before everything changed came from Jennifer. She'd always been the emotional center of our family, the one who remembered birthdays and organized reunions and made sure nobody felt forgotten during the holidays. But her letter carried a tone I'd never heard from her before. Sarah, I need to ask you something, and I hope you'll be honest with me. Are you safe over there? Not just physically safe, but are you still the person we sent away? Because when you call home now, you sound different, harder, like you're holding back parts of yourself we used to know. Mom's worried that whatever you're doing is changing you in ways we won't recognize when you come home. I read that letter in my bunk at 3 a.m, surrounded by the sounds of generators and distant radio chatter, and realized that my family was mourning someone who hadn't died. They were grieving the loss of the Sarah Williams they remembered, the small-town girl who'd enlisted with clear values and simple faith in doing good work. They couldn't see that the person I was becoming wasn't damaged or lost but developed, refined by experiences that had taught me the difference between following rules and following conscience. But how do you explain that growth to people who need you to remain the same person they sent away? How do you tell your family that the values they taught you are still intact, but your understanding of how to apply them has deepened in ways that can't be summarized in a phone call or a letter? 2 weeks after receiving Jennifer's letter, I faced the choice that would answer those questions in ways none of us expected. It happened on a Tuesday morning in February 2012, during what should have been a routine escort mission for a medical convoy heading to a rural clinic. Intelligence reports indicated the road was clear, local contacts had confirmed safe passage, and weather conditions were optimal for the 90-minute journey through terrain we'd traveled dozens of times before. But 30 minutes into the mission, everything went wrong in ways that no training manual could have prepared us for. The convoy came under attack not from enemy combatants, but from a faction of local militia that had been cooperating with coalition forces. The clinic we were heading to wasn't just treating civilians anymore. It had become a refuge for families fleeing violence in the surrounding villages, including children whose parents had been killed for helping American forces. As explosions rocked the vehicles around me, and radio communications dissolved into static and shouting, I realized that the rules of engagement we'd been trained to follow assumed a clear distinction between friend and enemy, between military objective and civilian protection. But the reality unfolding around me was messier than policy could accommodate. The people shooting at us were doing so because they believed we were threatening their families. The families we were trying to reach were in danger, precisely because they trusted us to keep them safe. In that moment, with smoke filling the air and wounded soldiers calling for help, I had to choose between following protocol and following the values my family had raised me to embrace. I could execute the mission as planned, knowing it would likely result in civilian casualties. Or I could make a decision that would save lives but violate direct orders. The choice I made that day would cost me everything I'd worked 20 years to build. It would turn me from the Williams family success story into their greatest source of shame. It would transform me from a daughter they celebrated into a cautionary tale they'd rather forget. But it would also save 43 lives, including 17 children who would grow up to become doctors, teachers, and parents, because one American soldier chose conscience over career in a moment when the world was watching through smoke and fire to see what kind of person she really was. That choice echoed all the way back to Millfield, Ohio, where my family was about to discover that sometimes doing the right thing means everyone else gets to think you did the wrong thing. And sometimes the people who taught you to stand up for what you believe in are the first ones to sit down when standing beside you becomes inconvenient. February 14, 2012. Valentine's Day. Most people back home were buying flowers and making dinner reservations. But in Kandahar province, love looked like making impossible choices under enemy fire. The morning started with intelligence briefings that painted a picture of routine danger. Our convoy would escort a medical team to a rural clinic 40 kilometers east of our forward operating base. The mission parameters were straightforward: provide security for the medical personnel, establish a perimeter around the clinic, and ensure safe passage back to base before nightfall. What the intelligence reports didn't mention was that the clinic had become something far more complex than a medical facility. Over the past 3 weeks, families fleeing sectarian violence had begun using it as an unofficial refugee center. Children whose parents had been killed for cooperating with coalition forces were sleeping in examination rooms. Elderly villagers who'd been threatened for accepting humanitarian aid were taking shelter in supply closets. The clinic's single doctor, a woman named Amira Naziri, had been working 18-hour days trying to provide medical care while also coordinating food distribution and temporary housing for displaced civilians. Dr. Naziri had been sending reports to coalition headquarters for weeks, requesting additional security and supplies for the growing refugee population. But those requests had become tangled in bureaucratic processes that moved slower than the violence forcing families from their homes. By the time our convoy received orders to escort the medical team, the clinic was sheltering over 200 people, including 43 children under the age of 12. The attack began 27 minutes into our journey, not with the distant sound of mortars or the whistle of incoming rockets, but with small arms fire that seemed to come from everywhere at once. The lead vehicle in our convoy, a heavily armored Humvee carrying medical supplies, took direct hits that shattered bulletproof glass and sent shrapnel ricocheting through the passenger compartment. The driver, Specialist Martinez, managed to maintain control long enough to pull behind a concrete barrier that had once marked the entrance to an abandoned gas station. I was riding in the third vehicle, coordinating communications between our convoy and the quick reaction force at our base, when the radio crackled with a transmission that changed everything. It wasn't from our command center or from the medical team we were escorting. It was from Dr. Naziri at the clinic, speaking in broken English, punctuated by the sound of automatic weapons fire. American convoy, please respond. We are under attack. Many children here. Need immediate assistance. Please, they are shooting at the clinic. The tactical situation was clear to anyone with basic military training. Our convoy was pinned down by hostile fire from an unknown number of attackers. Our primary mission was to secure the medical team and establish communications with headquarters for extraction or reinforcement. Engaging with additional threats outside our immediate area of operations would violate standing orders and potentially compromise the safety of the personnel under our protection. But as I listened to Dr. Naziri's increasingly desperate radio calls, I realized that our strict adherence to mission parameters was about to result in a massacre. The clinic was less than 2 kilometers from our position, close enough that we could hear the explosions echoing across the desert landscape. The families sheltering there had trusted coalition forces to protect them. The children sleeping in those examination rooms had parents who'd died helping American soldiers navigate their homeland. I tried to raise our command center on the radio, requesting permission to divert to the clinic and provide assistance. Static. I switched frequencies and attempted to contact the Quick Reaction Force. More static. Either our communications equipment had been damaged in the attack, or someone had decided that maintaining radio silence was more important than responding to evolving threats in the field. While I struggled with dead radio channels, Corporal Jackson, our convoy's medic, was treating Specialist Martinez for shrapnel wounds. The injured driver kept asking about the medical team, whether they were safe, whether we were going to complete the mission. He'd joined the Army to serve in combat, not to hide behind concrete barriers while civilians died within walking distance of our position. "Captain," Corporal Jackson called out, "Martinez says the medical team was supposed to include pediatric supplies, vaccines for kids at the clinic. If we don't get there today, some of those children won't have another chance." The weight of that information settled over me like armor I hadn't asked to wear. This wasn't just about following orders or protecting American personnel anymore. It was about honoring commitments we'd made to people who'd risked everything to trust us. The children at that clinic weren't abstract casualties or collateral damage. They were specific individuals whose safety had become our responsibility the moment their families chose to cooperate with coalition forces. I made the decision that would define the rest of my life in the space of a heartbeat. Instead of waiting for orders that might never come, instead of prioritizing the safety of American personnel over the lives of Afghan civilians, I chose to interpret our mission in the broadest possible terms. Our job was to provide security for medical personnel delivering aid to vulnerable populations. The most vulnerable population in our area of operations was currently under attack less than 2 kilometers from our position. "Listen up," I announced to my convoy over the internal communications system. "We're moving to the clinic. 2 vehicles will establish overwatch positions on the ridgeline overlooking the facility. 1 vehicle will provide direct support for evacuation of civilians. We complete the original medical mission and extract any non-combatants who want to leave with us." Sergeant Torres, my most experienced non-commissioned officer, questioned the decision immediately. "Captain, we don't have authorization to expand the mission parameters. We're supposed to wait for instructions from command." "Sergeant, our communications are down, civilians are under fire, and we have medical supplies that people need right now. I'm interpreting our orders to provide security for medical operations in the broadest sense possible. And if command disagrees with your interpretation, then command can court-martial me after we save those kids." The convoy reached the clinic in less than 10 minutes, moving through terrain that provided natural cover from the attackers who'd been firing on both our position and the medical facility. What we found when we arrived was worse than anything Dr. Naziri's radio calls had conveyed. The clinic's main building had taken multiple direct hits from rocket-propelled grenades. Windows were blown out, walls were collapsed, and small fires burned in several rooms where medical equipment had been destroyed. But the people inside were alive. Frightened, wounded, but alive. Dr. Naziri met us at what remained of the clinic's entrance, her surgical scrubs torn and blood-stained, her hands shaking from exhaustion and adrenaline. Behind her, families huddled in interior rooms that offered protection from incoming fire. Children clutched stuffed animals and blankets, their eyes wide with the kind of terror that ages people before their time. "Thank God you came," Dr. Naziri said, speaking English with the careful precision of someone who'd learned the language from textbooks. "They have been shooting for 30 minutes. I think they want to force everyone to leave, but where can we go? These families have nowhere else." The tactical assessment was straightforward but grim. The attacking force consisted of approximately 20 fighters positioned in the hills surrounding the clinic. They had the high ground and superior knowledge of the terrain, but their weapons were primarily small arms and improvised explosive devices. Our convoy had heavier firepower and better communications equipment, but we were operating without support and limited by rules of engagement designed to minimize civilian casualties. More importantly, we were facing an enemy that was using the refugee families as a strategic consideration. They knew that American forces would be reluctant to return fire if it meant putting children at risk. They were counting on our moral constraints to give them tactical advantages. I established a command post in the clinic's administrative office and began coordinating what military doctrine calls a non-combatant evacuation operation. In plain language, we were going to move 200 people, including 43 children, from a building under active attack to vehicles that could transport them to safety. We had 3 trucks, limited fuel, and an unknown amount of time before enemy reinforcements arrived, or our own command structure discovered that we'd exceeded our authorized mission scope. The evacuation began with the children. Corporal Jackson and 2 other soldiers moved through the clinic, identifying the youngest and most vulnerable individuals who needed immediate transport. They wrapped babies in military-issue blankets, carried toddlers who were too frightened to walk, and held the hands of school-age kids who kept asking where their parents were and when they could go home. Dr. Nazieri served as our translator, explaining to families that American soldiers were going to take them to a safe location where they could receive medical care and temporary shelter. Some parents were reluctant to trust us, remembering stories of families who'd cooperated with coalition forces and later faced retaliation from insurgent groups. Others pressed photographs and personal documents into our hands, asking us to promise that their children would remember where they came from if something happened during the journey. While the first group of evacuees was being loaded into our vehicles, I received a radio transmission that stopped my blood cold. It wasn't from Dr. Naziri or from any member of my convoy. It was from Colonel James Mitchell, my commanding officer back at the forward operating base. Captain Williams, this is Overlord 6. Report your current position and mission status immediately. I knew that tone. It was the voice of a superior officer who discovered that one of his subordinates had made a decision without authorization. It was the sound of a career-ending conversation that was about to begin. Overlord 6, this is Falcon 2-7. We are providing security for non-combatant evacuation at the medical clinic. Civilian population under fire. Request immediate support for ongoing operations. Falcon 2-7, you are ordered to return to base immediately. Cease current operations and establish contact for extraction coordination. The radio went silent, but the meaning was clear. I was being ordered to abandon the evacuation, leave the remaining families at the clinic, and return to base where I would face questions about why I'd exceeded my mission authorization. In military terms, this was the moment when following orders meant choosing to prioritize institutional protocol over human lives. I looked around the clinic at families who were trusting American soldiers to keep promises our government had made. I saw children whose parents had been killed for believing that cooperation with coalition forces would lead to safety and stability. I watched Dr. Naziri moving between patients, treating wounds with supplies we'd brought, her face reflecting hope that help had finally arrived. And I made the second decision that would cost me my rank, my reputation, and eventually my family's respect. I reached for the radio and transmitted what every person in that clinic needed to hear, even if it meant the end of my military career. Overlord 6, Falcon 2-7. Message received and understood. Will comply after completion of current evacuation operations. Estimate 30 mics for full extraction of non-combatants. Request you stand by. I switched off the radio before Colonel Mitchell could respond. In the space of that transmission, I'd bought 30 minutes to save 43 children and their families. I'd also guaranteed that when we returned to base, I'd face a court-martial for disobeying direct orders during combat operations. But as I watched Corporal Jackson help a 5-year-old girl into one of our vehicles, as I saw that child smile for the first time since we'd arrived at the clinic, I knew that some choices are worth whatever consequences they bring. Sometimes doing the right thing means accepting that everyone else will think you did the wrong thing. The evacuation took 28 minutes. Every family that wanted to leave the clinic was transported to a coalition-operated refugee center where they could receive medical care, temporary housing, and protection, while longer-term solutions were arranged. Every child who'd been sleeping in examination rooms was moved to a facility with proper beds, regular meals, and access to education programs. We completed our mission and saved every life we'd come to protect. But when our convoy returned to the forward operating base that afternoon, I discovered that success in saving lives doesn't always translate to success in military evaluations. Sometimes the most important victories are the ones that never appear in official reports. The courtroom filled with whispers like leaves rustling before a storm. Judge Martinez banged her gavel twice, calling for order, but the murmur of confused voices continued to ripple through the gallery. My father remained frozen in his seat, his face cycling through expressions I'd never seen before. Confusion gave way to recognition to disbelief, and disbelief to something that looked dangerously close to hope. Bailiff Marcus Johnson maintained his salute for exactly 3 seconds, military precision, even in a civilian setting. When he lowered his hand, He didn't return to his position by the judge's bench. Instead, he took 2 steps forward, close enough that the entire courtroom could hear him clearly. "Your Honor," he said, addressing Judge Martinez, while keeping his eyes on me, "I request permission to address the court regarding new information relevant to the character assessment portion of these proceedings." Michael shot to his feet. "Objection, Your Honor. The bailiff is not a witness in this case, and his comments are not relevant to the custody determination." Judge Martinez studied Marcus Johnson with the careful attention of someone trying to solve a puzzle. "Bailiff Johnson, what information could you possibly have about this family's custody matter?" "Your Honor, I served 3 tours in Afghanistan between 2010 and 2014. During my second deployment, I was part of a refugee protection detail at Forward Operating Base Kandahar. On February 14, 2012, my unit received 43 Afghan civilians, including 17 children, who had been evacuated from a clinic under attack. The officer who led that evacuation, who risked her career to save those lives, was Captain Sarah Williams. The courtroom fell into absolute silence. Not the polite quiet of people listening to testimony, but the profound stillness that comes when everyone realizes they're witnessing something unprecedented. My father's knuckles were white against the wooden bench. Jennifer's husband had stopped taking notes. Even Tommy, sitting between my father and Michael's wife, seemed to sense that something monumental was happening. "Those children," Marcus continued, "arrived at our base with nothing but the clothes on their backs and the blankets that Captain Williams' soldiers had wrapped around them. They were scared, hungry, and traumatized. But they were alive because one American officer chose to interpret her orders in favor of protecting innocent lives rather than following protocol." Judge Martinez leaned forward. "Bailiff Johnson, are you saying that Ms. Williams was involved in a successful rescue operation?" "Yes, Your Honor. But that's not the remarkable part. The remarkable part is what happened after the evacuation. Captain Williams was brought up on charges for exceeding her mission parameters. She faced a military tribunal for the same actions that saved those 43 people. And instead of defending herself, instead of explaining the circumstances that forced her to make an impossible choice, she accepted responsibility for disobeying orders." Michael found his voice. "Your Honor, this is highly irregular. We're here to determine custody arrangements for a minor child, not to relitigate decade-old military decisions." "Mr. Williams," Judge Martinez said, her tone carrying the authority of someone who'd spent 20 years managing courtroom disruptions, "your family has spent the morning arguing that your sister's military discharge makes her unsuitable to have any relationship with your nephew. If there are facts about that discharge that weren't presented in your custody petition, I think we need to hear them." Marcus Johnson reached into his uniform pocket and withdrew a folded piece of paper. "Your Honor, I have here a letter from Dr. Amira Naziri, the physician who was running the clinic that came under attack in 2012. She now works at Johns Hopkins Hospital in Baltimore. She asked me to read this if I ever had the opportunity to speak publicly about what Captain Williams did that day." The paper rustled as Marcus unfolded it, the sound amplified by the perfect silence in the courtroom. He cleared his throat and began to read. "To anyone who will listen. My name is Dr. Amira Naziri. On February 14, 2012, I was running a medical clinic in Kandahar province that had become a shelter for families fleeing violence. When armed militants attacked our facility, I thought we were all going to die. I had 43 children in my care, some as young as 3 years old, and nowhere to take them for safety." Marcus paused, looking up from the letter to meet my eyes. "Captain Sarah Williams arrived with her convoy during the attack. She had orders to escort a medical team to our clinic and return to base. Instead, when she heard that children were in danger, she made the decision to evacuate everyone who wanted to leave. She put her career, her reputation, and her freedom at risk to save people she had never met and would never see again." He returned to the letter. "What most people don't know is that Captain Williams could have defended her actions during her military tribunal. She had documentation proving that the clinic was being used as a refugee shelter. She had radio transmissions showing that my calls for help had been ignored by command headquarters. She had witnessed statements from Afghan interpreters confirming that the families at the clinic had been threatened for cooperating with coalition forces. I felt something loosen in my chest, a tension I'd carried for so long that I'd forgotten it was there. For 8 years, I'd wondered if anyone remembered the context of that day, if anyone understood that the choice I'd made hadn't been reckless but necessary. But Captain Williams never presented that evidence, Marcus continued reading. She never mounted a defense. When I asked her why, during a brief conversation before her discharge, she told me that fighting the charges would require revealing classified information about the families we'd helped. It would mean putting their names in public records where people who wanted to hurt them could find them. She said protecting their anonymity was more important than protecting her reputation. The letter concluded with words that hit the courtroom like stones thrown into still water. Captain Williams chose to be court-martialed rather than compromise the safety of 43 civilians she'd risked everything to save. In my country, we have a word for such a person, qahraman. It means hero, but the literal translation is one who conquers fear. Captain Williams conquered her fear of losing everything she'd worked for because saving lives mattered more than saving face. Marcus folded the letter and returned it to his pocket. Your Honor, I've spent 12 years thinking about what I witnessed that day. Captain Williams didn't just save 43 people. She showed every soldier in her unit what it means to put human decency above military bureaucracy. She demonstrated that sometimes the greatest act of service is accepting punishment for doing what's right. The silence stretched until Judge Martinez spoke. Bailiff Johnson, how is it that you're here today in this specific courtroom for this specific case? Marcus smiled for the first time since he'd entered the room. Your Honor, when I left the Army, I moved to Ohio to be closer to my elderly parents. I've been working as a bailiff in Riverside County for 3 years. When I saw the name Sarah Williams on today's docket, I thought it might be a coincidence. But when I saw her sitting in that back row, looking exactly like the officer who'd saved those children, I knew I had to speak up. This is all very touching, Michael interjected, but it doesn't change the fact that my sister was discharged from the military under controversial circumstances. It doesn't change the fact that she's been estranged from our family for years. And it certainly doesn't qualify her to have custody of a 10-year-old boy. Judge Martinez turned her attention to me. Ms. Williams, you've been remarkably quiet during these proceedings. Would you like to respond to what we've just heard? I stood slowly, feeling the weight of every eye in the courtroom. For 8 years, I'd practiced staying invisible, avoiding attention, accepting that my version of events would never be heard. But sitting in that courthouse, listening to Marcus Johnson read Dr. Naziri's letter, I realized that silence had protected everyone, except the people who deserved to know the truth. Your Honor, I need to be clear about something. I'm not here to seek custody of my nephew. I don't have the financial resources or the stable home environment that my brother can provide. I'm here because Tommy asked his mother before her accident if he could invite Aunt Sarah to court. He wanted me to be present during the most important decision of his young life. I looked at Tommy, sitting between his grandfather and aunt-in-law, his 10-year-old face serious with the gravity of adult problems he shouldn't have to understand. I haven't seen Tommy in over 2 years because my family believed that my presence would be harmful to his development. They believed that I was someone who made poor decisions under pressure, someone whose judgment couldn't be trusted, someone whose military service had ended in disgrace. The words came easier now, like water finally flowing through a dam that had cracked. They believed those things because I never corrected them. I never explained what really happened in Afghanistan, because doing so would have required me to violate confidentiality agreements designed to protect vulnerable people. I chose to let my family think less of me rather than risk the safety of 43 civilians who'd trusted American soldiers to keep them safe. My father was staring at me now, not with the cold distance I'd grown accustomed to, but with something that looked like recognition. But I realize now that my silence has cost more than just my relationship with my family. It's cost Tommy the chance to know his aunt, to understand that sometimes doing the right thing means accepting consequences that seem unfair, and to learn that real honor isn't about avoiding controversy, but about standing up for people who can't stand up for themselves. I turned to address the judge directly. Your Honor, I'm not asking for custody. I'm asking for the right to be part of Tommy's life. To take him fishing and teach him how to change a tire, and answer his questions about what it means to serve something bigger than yourself. I'm asking for the chance to show him that sometimes the people who disappoint you aren't the ones who make mistakes, but the ones who refuse to listen when you try to explain why those mistakes were actually choices. Judge Martinez made notes on her legal pad while I spoke. When I finished, she looked up with the expression of someone who'd spent years sorting through complicated family dynamics and broken relationships. Ms. Williams, the court appreciates your candor. However, custody determinations are based on the best interests of the child, not on military service records or family reconciliation needs. Can you tell me why you believe maintaining a relationship with you would benefit Tommy specifically? The question hung in the air like a challenge, not just from the judge, but from my father, my brother, and everyone who'd spent years believing that keeping me away from Tommy was the responsible choice. I thought about the 10-year-old boy who'd once been excited about a remote-controlled helicopter, who'd asked if his Aunt Sarah was a hero, who'd wanted me present for the most important day of his childhood, even though he'd been taught to keep emotional distance from me. Your Honor, last month Tommy called me. He wasn't supposed to have my phone number, but somehow he'd found it and decided to use it. He called because he'd been assigned a school project about heroes, and he wanted to know why his family never talked about what I did in the Army. I could see Michael shifting uncomfortably in his seat, probably remembering conversations about limiting Tommy's access to information about his controversial aunt. I told him that sometimes heroes are the people who do their jobs quietly and don't need recognition. But he said that wasn't what he meant. He said he'd heard other kids talking about their family members who served in the military, sharing stories about their courage and their sacrifices. And he wanted to know why his family didn't have those stories about me. The courtroom was absolutely still. Even the court reporter had stopped typing, waiting to hear what came next. I realized that Tommy wasn't asking me to be his hero. He was asking me to stop letting his family treat military service like something to be ashamed of. He was asking me to help him understand why doing the right thing sometimes costs more than doing the easy thing. And he was asking me to trust him with the truth about who his Aunt Sarah really is, instead of protecting him from a story his family thought was too complicated for a child to understand. Judge Martinez set down her pen and studied me with the careful attention of someone making a decision that would affect multiple lives. Ms. Williams, what would you want your relationship with Tommy to look like if the court were to approve visitation? I'd want to take him camping and teach him how to read a compass and a map. I'd want to show him how to identify edible plants and build a fire without matches. I'd want him to learn that survival isn't about being the strongest or the loudest, but about being resourceful and taking care of the people around you. I paused, thinking about the child who'd called me against family rules because he needed answers no one else was willing to provide. But mostly, Your Honor, I'd want Tommy to know that he comes from a family where people serve others, even when that service comes with a cost. I'd want him to understand that his Aunt Sarah didn't fail in Afghanistan. She succeeded so completely that the people she saved are still alive today, still grateful, still telling anyone who will listen about the American soldier who chose their lives over her career. That's when something extraordinary happened. Tommy, who'd been sitting quietly between the adults managing his future, raised his hand like he was in school asking permission to speak. Judge Martinez, he said in the clear, confident voice of a child who'd been raised to believe his opinions mattered. Can I say something? Every adult in the courtroom turned to stare at the 10-year-old boy whose custody we'd been debating. Judge Martinez smiled, the first genuine expression of warmth I'd seen from her all day. Of course, Tommy, this is about your future. What would you like to tell us? Tommy stood up in the gallery, his small frame dwarfed by the formal setting of the courtroom, but his presence commanding attention in a way that surprised every adult present. He looked directly at Judge Martinez, with the earnest intensity that only children possess when they're about to say something they've been thinking about for a long time. I want to live with Uncle Michael because he has a big house and he can help me with homework and he knows about schools and stuff like that, Tommy began, his voice steady despite the magnitude of the moment. But I also want to see Aunt Sarah because she's the only person in my family who ever told me the truth about hard things. Judge Martinez leaned forward, her professional demeanor softening into something more maternal. What do you mean by that, Tommy? Well, When my mom got hurt in the car accident, everyone kept telling me she was going to be fine and not to worry. But Aunt Sarah came to the hospital and sat with me in the waiting room and told me that sometimes people we love get hurt really badly, and we don't know what's going to happen, but we can still hope, and we can still take care of each other while we're waiting to find out. My father turned to look at me with an expression I couldn't read. I'd driven 4 hours to the hospital the night Jennifer was admitted, not because anyone had called me, but because I'd seen the news report about a multi-car accident on the interstate, and recognized Jennifer's license plate number when they showed footage of the wreckage. I'd sat with Tommy for 6 hours while the rest of the family handled insurance paperwork and medical consultations, answering his questions with the kind of honesty that adults usually avoid when talking to children about tragedy. And when Grandpa's dog died last year, everyone said Rex went to live on a farm where he could run around and be happy. But Aunt Sarah told me that Rex died because he was old and sick, and that being sad about it was okay because it meant we loved him. She said that pretending death doesn't happen doesn't make it hurt less, it just makes us afraid to love things, because we think we're not supposed to feel sad when we lose them. Tommy looked around the courtroom at the adults who'd been making decisions about his future without consulting him. I think Uncle Michael would be a good guardian because he's responsible and he has money and he knows how to take care of things. But I think I need Aunt Sarah too, because she's the only grown-up who talks to me like I'm smart enough to understand true stuff instead of just nice stuff. Judge Martinez made notes while Tommy spoke, occasionally glancing up to study the faces of the family members whose relationships were being redefined by a 10-year-old's clarity about what he needed from the adults in his life. Tommy, if the court were to allow you to live with your Uncle Michael while also spending time with your Aunt Sarah, what would that look like to you? I'd want to visit her on some weekends, and maybe during summer vacation. I'd want her to teach me the stuff she learned in the Army, like how to be brave when things are scary, and how to help people who need help. And I'd want her to tell me more stories about the children she saved, because I think those are important stories, and I think other kids should know about them too. The courtroom fell silent as Tommy sat back down, his child's perspective cutting through layers of adult complexity to identify what really mattered. Judge Martinez spent several moments reviewing her notes before addressing the assembled family. I've heard enough testimony today to make my determination. Mr. Williams, the court finds that you are financially and emotionally prepared to provide primary custody for Tommy. Your home environment is stable, your career provides adequate resources for his education and development, and your commitment to his welfare is evident. Michael nodded, relief visible on his face. However, Judge Martinez continued, the court also finds that the concerns raised about Ms. Williams's suitability for any relationship with Tommy were based on incomplete information about her military service. Based on the testimony we've heard today, it appears that Ms. Williams' discharge was the result of her prioritizing civilian safety over military protocol, which suggests strong moral character rather than poor judgment. She turned to address me directly. Ms. Williams, while your long estrangement from your family raises questions about your ability to maintain consistent relationships, your nephew's clear desire to have you in his life, combined with the character testimony we've heard today, convinces me that supervised visitation would be in Tommy's best interests. The word supervised stung, but I understood the court's caution. 8 years of family estrangement couldn't be erased by 1 day of testimony, no matter how revelatory. The court orders that Tommy will reside primarily with his Uncle Michael, with supervised visitation with his Aunt Sarah twice monthly for the first 6 months. If those visits proceed without incident, we'll revisit the supervision requirement and potentially expand the visitation schedule. Judge Martinez banged her gavel, making the arrangement official. But the formal conclusion of the hearing didn't end the emotional reckoning that had begun when Marcus Johnson rendered his unexpected salute. As people began gathering their belongings and filing out of the courtroom, my father remained seated, staring at his hands like he was trying to solve a puzzle he'd been working on for years. Michael approached me with the careful expression of someone navigating unfamiliar territory. Sarah, I owe you an apology. Not just for today, but for the last 8 years. I should have asked more questions. I should have tried to understand what really happened, instead of just accepting the version of events that was easiest to believe. You protected your family's reputation, Michael. I understand why that felt necessary. No, I protected my own reputation. I was afraid that having a sister with a controversial military discharge would hurt my political aspirations. I convinced myself that keeping distance from you was about protecting Tommy and Dad, but really it was about protecting myself from having to defend choices I didn't understand. My brother extended his hand, a formal gesture that carried weight in a family where physical affection had always been rare. I'd like Tommy to spend his first unsupervised weekend with you, if you're willing. The offer surprised me, not just because of its generosity, but because it represented a level of trust I hadn't expected to earn back so quickly. Michael, are you sure? The court said supervised visits for 6 months. The court said that because they don't know you the way we should have known you. Tommy's right. He needs someone in his life who will tell him the truth about difficult things. He needs to understand that doing the right thing sometimes costs more than doing the easy thing. And he needs to know that his Aunt Sarah is someone worth being proud of. As we talked, I noticed my father approaching with the slow, careful steps of someone carrying a heavy burden. When he reached us, he stood for a moment without speaking, his eyes moving between Michael and me like he was comparing us to memories of who we used to be. Sarah, he said finally, I need to tell you something I should have said 8 years ago. I braced myself for another lecture about family reputation and community standing, the kind of conversation that had driven the wedge between us deeper with each repetition. I was wrong. The words hung in the air like something fragile that might break if handled carelessly. I was wrong to believe that the Army would discharge a good officer for doing good work. I was wrong to assume that you wouldn't defend yourself unless you were guilty of something worth hiding. And I was wrong to let my pride matter more than my daughter's integrity. My father's voice carried the weight of someone making a confession he'd been avoiding for years. When the news reports came out about your court-martial, I told myself that believing them was easier than fighting them. I told myself that supporting you would mean questioning institutions I'd spent my life respecting. But the truth is, I was afraid. Afraid of what, Dad? Afraid that if I stood up for you, I'd have to admit that the systems I'd trusted my whole career, the police department and the military and the government I'd served, might sometimes get things wrong. It was easier to believe you'd made a mistake than to believe they had. He reached into his jacket pocket and withdrew something I hadn't seen in years. My Army promotion photo, the one that had hung in the hallway between Michael's law school graduation and Jennifer's teaching certificate. The frame was dusty and the glass was cracked, but he'd kept it. I took this down after your discharge because I thought it represented a chapter of our family story that we needed to close. But listening to that bailiff today, hearing about the children you saved, I realized this photo represents the most important chapter of our family's story. It represents the moment when a Williams chose conscience over convenience, when someone we raised proved that our values were worth sacrificing everything to defend. He handed me the frame with hands that trembled slightly. I'd like to put this back up in the hallway if you'll let me. Not because your military career ended differently than we expected, but because it ended exactly the way we should have hoped it would. The drive back to my apartment in Columbus usually took 3 hours, but that evening I stopped at a rest area halfway home and sat in my car for nearly an hour, holding my promotion photo and trying to process everything that had changed in a single day. For 8 years, I'd carried the weight of my family's disappointment, like armor I couldn't remove. I'd built a quiet life around their absence, convinced myself that their love had been conditional on my success, and accepted that some bridges couldn't be rebuilt once they'd been burned. But sitting in that rest area parking lot, watching trucks and cars full of families heading toward their own complicated reunions and difficult conversations, I realized that healing doesn't always look like forgiveness. Sometimes it looks like understanding. Sometimes it looks like people willing to examine their assumptions and admit when they've been wrong. And sometimes it looks like a 10-year-old boy who cuts through years of adult complexity to say exactly what he needs from the grown-ups in his life. 3 weeks later, Tommy spent his first weekend at my apartment. We drove to a state park an hour outside Columbus and spent Saturday afternoon learning to identify animal tracks and edible plants. He asked dozens of questions about military life, about Afghanistan, about the children I'd helped evacuate, and about why adults sometimes make decisions that seem wrong until you understand the whole story. On Sunday morning, as we sat on my small balcony drinking hot chocolate and watching birds at the feeder I'd hung outside my kitchen window, Tommy asked me the question I'd been expecting since the custody hearing. "Aunt Sarah, do you think my mom is going to wake up?" I could have deflected with optimistic platitudes about medical advances and the power of positive thinking. I could have told him that everything would work out fine and not to worry about things beyond his control. But I'd learned something important in that courtroom about the kind of relationship Tommy needed from me. "I don't know, Tommy. The doctors don't know either. What I do know is that whether she wakes up or not, you're going to be okay. You've got Uncle Michael who loves you and will take care of you. You've got Grandpa who's learning how to be proud of his family in new ways. And you've got me, and I'll always tell you the truth about hard things, even when the truth is that we don't know what's going to happen next." He nodded with the gravity of someone far older than 10. "That's what I thought you'd say. That's why I wanted you to come to court." 6 months later, the supervised visitation requirement was lifted. Tommy now spends every other weekend with me, plus 2 weeks each summer. We go camping, we practice wilderness survival skills, and we talk about courage and conscience, and the difference between doing what's easy and doing what's right. He's writing a report for school about family heroes, and he's chosen to write about his Aunt Sarah, who saved 43 people and then saved her relationship with her family by refusing to let silence substitute for truth. My father and I have coffee together once a month at Tony's Diner in Millfield. We don't talk much about the lost years or the misunderstandings that kept us apart. Instead, we talk about Tommy's school projects, about my work with veteran support groups, and about his plans to visit the Afghan families who've resettled in the United States over the past decade. He wants to meet the children I helped evacuate, to shake their hands and tell them that his daughter's choice to save them was the proudest moment in the Williams family's long history of service. Jennifer remains in a coma, but I visit her twice a month and read her updates about Tommy's progress in school, about Michael's successful law practice, and about the family dinners where my place at the table is no longer empty. I tell her about the weekend camping trips and the fishing lessons, and the conversations about difficult truths that her son handles with wisdom that would make her proud. Sometimes the most important victories aren't the ones that make headlines or earn recognition. Sometimes they're the quiet moments when people choose to listen instead of judge, when families decide to rebuild trust one conversation at a time, and when children teach adults that love doesn't require perfection, just honesty. I still live in my small apartment in Columbus. I still drive a 10-year-old car and buy my clothes at thrift stores. But I no longer live in exile from my own family, and I no longer carry their disappointment like a weight I can't set down. The truth about Kandahar province didn't change what happened there, but it changed how the people I love understand who I am and what I chose to fight for when fighting mattered most. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.